All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Multi-Agent Learning Seminar. Today we have Max Olin Smith with us. He'll be talking about strategic knowledge transfer. Before he does that, let me give you a little bit of an introduction about Max. So Max is a recent PhD graduate from University of Michigan. His main research interests are in reinforcement learning in multi-agent systems. In this area, he is particularly interested in the subproblems of evaluation, exploration, and adaptability, which present additional challenges from other agents in the system. He previously spent time at Google, Mila, and DeepMind. Yeah, so we're really excited for your talk on strategic knowledge transfer, Max. Take it away.
Great. And thank you for the introduction, Rafali. And thank you all for coming and for those online for your attention. So today I'll be talking about our work on strategic knowledge transfer in game solving in particular. So this was done alongside my collaborators, Thomas Anthony and Michael Lum. So as most of you are very well aware, we've seen lots of really nice breakthroughs in multi-agent reinforcement learning from DeepMind's Go playing agents to more recent work in StarCraft and Dota. If we zoom in on the StarCraft work specifically, we can see the population of agents that were trained along the way to getting their final agent. So on the y-axis of this graph is an estimate of the quality of each agent with ELO. And on the x-axis, we see how much real time has elapsed across training. So in this work, agents are trained to be a distribution of agents that are already in the population that they've collected. And here they have three different methods of sampling their opponents, distinguished by color. So in total, this work used 384 TPUs over the course of 44 days to generate a population of nearly 900 agents. So in other words, this took 46 TPU years to compute. So while this work is an incredible accomplishment, the computational demands that are required to run algorithms like this dramatically limit their applicability to other problems and even other practitioners. So that's why in today's talk, we'll be looking at ways to make the techniques that underline these successes more accessible. And we're going to do this by using transfer learning to reduce the cost of learning in games. So by a game, what I mean is any multi-agent system. Games also typically offer us a simplified view of some larger real-world problem, like traffic. But they can take many forms, from video games to board games and card games, and even real-world settings such as markets and sports. But why study games? Well, participating in games brings people together. It lets us understand how to behave in these complex situations, and it also lets people connect and build communities. Moreover, games teach us about ourselves. They capture what is called the art of agency. So as game developers, you not only create the game itself, but you also create who people can be within the game. And by taking on the limitations imposed by the game, you can share and learn more about agency. And I first encountered this idea on this book by C.T. Nguyen. So if that sounded interesting to you, I highly recommend it. It's really, really interesting read. It's a philosophy book, so it's also kind of it's a heavier read. So what does it mean to learn a solution to a game? So in single agent systems, agents are trained to maximize a cumulative reward signal called return. But in multi-agent systems, an agent's return depends on the other agent's strategies. And in practice, we'll often not know what their strategies are. Instead, we need to assume a solution concept. So this is some rule that we're going to use to predict how all the agents will likely behave. A very common solution concept to adopt is that of the Nash equilibrium. This rule says that all agents will maximize their individual rewards, and we can use this independently, and we can use this to predict how agents will behave. There are two common ways we'll use to represent agent behavior. So we have a policy, which is a mapping from observations to a distribution over actions, and a strategy, which is a distribution over a player's policies. And they'll sample that distribution at the start of each game. So they'll play a policy for a game and then maybe swap the next game. Solution is a special type of strategy that is adopting a solution concept. Okay, so these are sort of our fundamental building blocks with where we're going. So there's a problem. selecting a solution concept doesn't give us the opponent's policies or strategies to learn against. It only prescribes the result instead of describing how we end up at that result. So as an analogy in reinforcement learning, when we want to maximize return, just saying we want to maximize return doesn't tell us the policy that does that. So we need to somehow also find that policy. So empirical game theoretic analysis is the general framework we'll use to sort of tackle this. It allows us to search and solve for a selected solution concept. This is done by building an empirical model of a game to be solved for as a proxy for the game. So in this graphic here, I have a two-player game with each player having 3 policies. And this small game can be a model for a much larger real-world scale game. And the payoffs for each combination of policies are depicted here with bar graphs. Also, I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm just gonna, feel free to interrupt me at any point for any sort of questions. No big deal. Yeah. Okay. So we have our framing. We want to learn how to solve a game. Instead of solving a game, we're going to solve this model of a game as an approximate method because we can't analytically solve all games. So how do we go about creating this empirical game? We begin by assuming some initial set of policies, such as just a random policy for each player. A subroutine called strategy exploration will be performed, and that'll produce a new policy, and we'll do this for each player. This will expand the size of our empirical game, and then the payoffs for each cell in the empirical game can be estimated through simulation with each pair of policies for several episodes. So this overall process I have on screen here is just one iteration of empirical game construction. And this is repeated until either you converge and you can't find any better policies, or a wall time limit's reached. And this is a general algorithmic framework for solving a game. Under strong guarantees, this exactly solves games, but in practice, that's basically never possible. So I left off one key detail, which is how are we choosing which policies to add to the empirical game? A common choice is to include a policy that beats the empirical game's current solution. So if this is our example game, strategy exploration would occur by first solving the game. This will produce a distribution for each player, say the Nash equilibrium for the reduced game. And then we will use deep reinforcement learning or any best response calculation method to compute a response to that policy. When we use deep reinforcement learning, though, in particular, this gives us a subclass of EDTA methods called policy space response oracles. And this serves as a very general framework that's unifies many existing algorithms in game theory and multi-agent learning. This includes the algorithms that contributed to the successes in Go, Dota, and StarCraft. Something that's really cool is if we actually, the empirical game for StarCraft 2 was released publicly. So here we can see the 888 policies and how they respectively performed. And on the axes of this empirical game, they have the 4 different strategy exploration methods that they were running in parallel. So clearly this algorithm also falls within this PSRO framework. So that's how we're going to approach the problem of solving a game. So today we'll be looking at the problem of reducing the computational cost of game solving. So by cost, I'm here referring to the amount of data needed to train a policy. See, as this audience is, I'm sure, well aware, training one policy is quite demanding. Repeatedly training policies only exacerbates this problem. And the themes to the solutions I'll present today is to introduce new strategy exploration methods that feature transfer learning. So we'll begin by first comparing this round of strategy exploration with the previous rounds. We can see that the best response learning problems look largely the same. The only difference is that there's an additional policy and in the opponent's strategy set, and that they may have a different distribution over the policies that they're playing. These previously encountered opponents' policies present an opportunity for transfer learning. This will lead us to our first algorithm, mixed oracles. The idea behind this algorithm is simply to learn to be only the new opponent policy and try and transfer and reuse all of the rest. So in this case, I'll have a little cap on the agents to denote it's a specialized training against only a single policy. By changing the focus from learning to be the distribution over opponent policies with learning to be only the single opponent policy, we remove any variance that's induced by the opponent sampling process. And this makes the learning problem much cheaper generally. However, we'll still need to combine these individual responses into our original objective, which is the best response to the distribution of the opponent policies. Therefore, we need some method for combining these responses. And to do that, I'll formalize this as a question. This problem is a question. So how can we combine the responses? First, we're going to assume that we're given experience playing against a fixed set of opponent policies. In this case, in this example, we just have 3. And the question is, how can we reuse the experience from training against this fixed set of opponent policies to generate a agent that can play against any distribution of these same opponents? So here we have the simplex over those 3 policies. The first approach we looked at was just trying to do a direct computation on policies. So can we take the best response to the individual opponent's policies and directly compute the mixed strategy response? If we do this without making, and we're going to do this without making any additional assumptions about the nature of any of these policies. We learned that this is impossible, and we introduced the opponent policy identification game to sort of highlight why this isn't possible. So this game begins by our co-player sampling their policy from a distribution sigma. So we'll have left and right. From our perspective, in information state 0, so that dashed space, we don't know whether the opponent picked the left or right policy. However, we'll have an opportunity to pay a cost, epsilon, to observe the identity of the opponent. And if we pay this cost, then we'll know what they are. And if we don't pay this cost, then we'll still remain in ignorance. After this round of choosing to observe, we'll play a coordination game with the opponent. In this coordination game, if both players play the same action, they receive a reward of 1, and if not, 0. Note here, the left player always plays left, right always plays right, as sort of their name implies. And the leaf nodes of this tree contain the final payoffs that we would receive. So, yeah. And if we didn't choose to observe, we'll say that we're passing on that opportunity. The benefit of passing is we never have to pay any observation cost, but we will remain uncertain over what opponent policy is being played. So we can compute a best response to the left opponent pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, we know that we're playing the left player, so we shouldn't observe and pay some sort of arbitrary cost because it's unnecessary. The cheaper thing to do is to just pass on the cost and play left because we know that it'll happen, and we'll get a reward of 1. A similar argument can be made for the right policy or the right opponent. We know they're going to play right, so we should just play right and not pay any costs. But our original problem is to construct a best response to a distribution of these opponents at the top of the tree. And we have a problem. See, neither of the policies for best responding to each of the individual opponent policies ever takes the observe action. So depending on the value of epsilon, the observe action can be the best action to select. So the key takeaway from this game, if there was a little too much detail here, is that individual best response policies can often lack key information gathering behavior that's necessary if you want to learn how to respond against an unknown opponent. So yeah, this is as hairy of a slide as I got. So if this doesn't totally sink in right away, that's fine. So we have this problem where we don't have enough information to compute policy to a distribution of opponents, and all we have is these individual opponent response policies. If we make an additional assumption about the individual opponent response policies, that they're value-based, what we do is we allow the policies to record information about all possible actions as opposed to just best actions. And this allows us to have more information to use to compute the distribution response. So in the idea we call Q-mixing, it's quite simple. All we're going to do is estimate the Q values to play against the distribution of opponents, here with the sigma, and we're going to have our darker yellow guy. By averaging the Q values against each individual opponent, so remember that these guys in the hats are trained to be each of the individual opponent policies, and they're also denoted by the respective pi instead of sigma. And we'll weight each of these best responses by a likelihood and of each of their respective opponents, here modeled by some function psi. So this quantity can be exactly computed under exceptionally strong assumptions. Effectively, you need to have the game's dynamics, a perfect likelihood, and exact Q values, because you need to back up evolving evidence about your opponents through time. So this is not very tractable, and instead we look at approximate versions to doing Q-mixing. So I'll begin by, I'll talk today about two of these versions. The first one I'm going to call prior. This is going to be quite simple. All it's going to do is weight the best response policies by the distribution that the opponent's using to sample. So what's worth noting here is we're in the centralized training regime, so it's very okay to make the assumption that we have access to the opponent's sampling distribution. And then we'll look at another version called OPC. This is going to be a learned likelihood model that uses evidence during play to update and inform the likelihood. We extensively evaluated Q-mixing on Running with Scissors, as well as some other games. Running with Scissors is a temporally extended version of Rock, Paper, Scissors, where agents compete to collect Rock, Paper, Scissors items around a grid world, and then they play Rock, Paper, Scissors following the distribution of items that they've collected at the end of an episode. To evaluate the performance of Q-mixing, we tested its ability to construct a response to any distribution of opponents. Our method to answer this question was as follows. We first trained 3 opponent policies that are specialized to prefer each of Rock, Paper, and Scissors, and we did this with an auxiliary reward. We then trained 3 pure strategy responses to each of these opponent policies. All of these policies here were trained using a variant of double TQN, so very simple standard stuff. And then we evaluate Q-mixing's ability to play against a representative coverage of the opponent strategy space. So here we're going to look at how well does it perform against each distribution truncated to the 10th place over the same set of policies. So this is some measure of how well are we able to generalize the best response learning that we've conducted. So on the, yes.
Eugene? Ask a quick question. Is this mixing over time steps or mixivizing over policy selection?
Mixing over time steps.
Yeah, like when the distribution, the opponent distribution, is it like at each time step drawing which policy it plays an action from, or is it are you picking a policy then playing through it for the whole episode?
The latter. That's a good question. That's a very important detail. Is the assumption is that you are sampling a policy to play for an episode, and that policy is fixed.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for the question. Yeah, cool. All right. So we're looking at how well we can generalize some sort of fixed amount of learning is sort of the goal here. On the x-axis, we'll have the 62 different strategies. Remember, this is a representative coverage of the full strategy space. Here, we're going to sort their respective response policies performance by the, we're going to sort the response policies by their performance, respectively. On the left plot, the y-axis contains the return, and on the right plot, we show a normalized version of this return. The normalized return allows us to account for the relative exploitability of the individual opponent policies. So you can imagine that the one of the opponent policies you might be able to rack up a really large score against, and that might distort your results. So we're trying to control from that and look at both results. As a baseline to Q-mixing, we're going to plot here an agent that was trained just against the uniform distribution of policies. And we'll see here these two versions of Q-mixing that I described earlier. So our results for this were as follows. So remember, these are all given the same data budget. Q-mixing enabled us to transfer learning more effectively across this representative coverage of opponent strategies. When this is the blue line that's above the purple line. And as is a pretty common observation in reinforcement learning, we can see that a policy trained in one particular environment, such as the best response to the uniform distribution, struggles to generalize and has quick fall off. It also is learning a much harder problem when training against the distribution of opponents that are uniform. As a result, it's showing much lower performance gain. And here the OPC line, which is the top green one in solid, is the one that is able to account for evidence during play to improve the value estimates. And we see here that it is performing quite well. Yes, we'll start with Manfred. Yeah. Do you have a question, Manny?
Yeah. Sorry, in the plot, what is the y-axis?
The y-axis, yeah.
Sorry. The x-axis.
Oh, yeah. The x-axis is the different opponent distributions. So that's why I have the little bar graph there. So in this case, we have 3 opponent policies. So we're looking at 62 different distributions over these 3 policies. In this case, those are the different distributions truncated to the 10th place, because we can't actually check how well it performs against the full distribution space.
So this is a point within the same place of the three responses that you train.
Yeah. So each of the, if you were to pick, say, the 0 point on the x-axis, it doesn't correspond to the same distribution for each method, because each method is sorted by how well it performs against each respective opponent distribution. Does that make sense? So like best response to the uniform has at the 0th place the uniform distribution opponent, because it's going to perform quite well against that because it's trained directly against it. Whereas the Q-mixing method doesn't necessarily best perform against the uniform distribution opponents. So at the 0th place, we would probably see maybe a singleton distribution. Or
yeah, sorry, just a follow-up question. But I don't understand, because in RPS, the uniform is the Nash. So if you perform well against the Nash, you should perform well against the rest of the mixture, right?
So in this case, we're not assuming uniform is Nash. We're really interested in how well you're generalizing, because we won't know a priori what the distribution we want to use to compute the best response is.
Can I pop in with a clarification? This is running with scissors, not RPS, right? So it's not clear that uniform is Nash. Is there any reason to think uniform is Nash in running with scissors?
Running with scissors does have a Nash of playing uniform, and yeah, but so that's actually, there is a degenerate Nash solution, which is none of the agents should pick up anything, and that's why they're initialized to have stuff in their inventory to try and prevent and deter against that Nash. But this is not that we're looking at here. Remember, this is not rock paper scissors is really the key here. So I wouldn't try and make connections directly to rock paper scissors, because the 3 opponent policies that we're featuring here only prefer certain items, and they don't exclusively collect those items. Sorry. Maybe I'll try answering Eugene's question, and if that still doesn't work, Manny, I'm happy to come back and maybe iron it out.
I think Seth had a hand raised before me, but this thing is also Daphne's question. So I guess Seth, and then we can go.
All right, Seth, do you have a question? The hand is gone. Okay, Daphne then?
Yeah. Okay. So, so this is rock paper scissors, right? To me, it's not exactly clear what the return is here. Are you measuring like the sum of the returns across the agents, or I mean, yeah. What exactly is the return here?
Yeah. So, in what we have here is a return averaged over many episodes. So the key thing that might be a little confusing here is that I'm saying we have this set of opponent policies and they're following a distribution. So for example, let's say that each point on this plot is 100 episodes averaged return. What this is 100 episodes where we're going to sample the opponent following this distribution and then get that return as a point estimate and then average those together. Does that help clarify?
Right?
I'm sorry?
So you have 3 opponents, right, in the rock paper scissors. So are you for every point, are you then sampling the opponents with in the same way, or are you showing like? So you have to sample a policy for each of the opponents, right?
So we're only going to play it. We're playing a 2 version of this game, so it's just us and one other player.
Oh.
And
okay.
at the beginning of the episode, they sample their policy, and they play that policy fixed. And we play a whole game. This gets us 1 sample return. Then that process is repeated for, in this case, I think it's 300 episodes. And we average all these point estimates of return.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Seth, yes, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I had a microphone issue before.
No worries.
So I really like the idea of this talk, but I was curious if you've thought about if you had your methodology versus your own methodology, what would be the behavior?
Oh, so how would Q mixing perform against Q mixing?
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question. It's not clear from this experiment what exactly should happen. And in general, like the method of Q mixing isn't like super well defined for. Yeah, I'm not sure. It would be interesting to see what the performance is, but I don't know if we would necessarily learn anything from having them play against each other. Yeah.
I guess my point was, in a lot of these competitive scenarios, you should, I guess, assume that the opponents would have also the ability to try to train in the same way. But I guess if you have the centralized assumption, this is not really territory to explore currently.
Yeah, so maybe when I back up to, so I'll give you a hint of where we're going. Remember,
Okay.
So right now we're just looking at some transfer method. We're just looking for some way to make each little best response computation in the PSRO framework a little bit cheaper. So really what we're building towards is how do we modify PSRO with this new technology to make PSRO cheaper. And then our sort of downstream deliverable is whatever solution PSRO is going to produce. So we don't necessarily want to use Q mixing as like our final deliverable, but just something to make things faster along the way. But that's a good question. Yeah. So in the interest of time, I will move on from this little point. It is not super essential to understand this plot to understand the rest of the talk, is the important thing. Q mixing lets us do some generalizations. And I would be more than happy to sort of tease apart the details of this when we go into the discussion section. For what it's worth, also, we tried a lot of baselines and did lots of different analysis. And it seems from all of this result that Q mixing allows us to generalize response learning from individual opponent policies to distribution of opponent policies. And that's sort of the key takeaway here, if any of the little details didn't totally stick. Yeah. So returning to mixed oracles, which is our strategy exploration modification to PSRO, we now have a method to combine responses with Q-mixing. And we evaluated Q-mixing on the Running with Scissors games and with the Common Harvest game. In this game, agents are rewarded for harvesting apples, but face a commons dilemma of over-harvesting. So if there's no orchard, there's no apples, there's no reward. This is a well-studied game that has its roots in human behavioral studies and has seen some prominence in the multi-agent literature as well. So we compared mixed oracles to PSRO as a baseline. On the x-axis here, we measure both the number of strategy exploration iterations, so how many policies we're computing on the left, and the cumulative amount of data as time steps used during learning on the right. And on the y-axis here, we're going to have an estimate of the regret of the solution throughout the game building process. And regret here is just the difference between the current solution and the best solution we ever found. So when we do this, on the right, we can see sort of the cost analysis. Mixed oracles converges around 10 million time steps, whereas PSRO is taking roughly 30 million time steps to converge to a similar quality solution. So this offers some evidence that this is a promising method to reduce the cumulative training time. And we did the results on some other games, which I don't have time to really dive into today. And there's a question, I think, from the NYU people leaning in, or is it just hard to see the yellow?
It's hard to see the yellow.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry about that. The yellow basically tails the bottom end of the confidence intervals of the blue. Yeah. Sorry, it shows a high variance on that yellow on different screens. It looks good on the paper though. So yeah, while developing mixed oracles, we had another idea. What if instead of combining our opponent responses to transfer learning, we combine the opponent policies instead? This might allow us to discover strategically important policies faster, thus requiring us to train fewer total policies to solve the game. So to understand why this might be a good idea, consider this really constructed example using rock, paper, scissors. And now we're not using running with scissors, so Manny, your intuitions here perfectly match. So in this case, we're going to look at two opponent value functions with the actions on the x-axis and their values on the y. We can see here that the left one, when playing the greedy policy, will only play rock, and on the right one, playing a greedy policy will only play paper, because those are the highest Q values. If we were to create a distribution over these two greedy policies, again, they would only play rock and paper. And in this case, the best response to that opponent distribution is paper, which we would have already discovered when we learned to beat the first opponent policy, which would be paper. So I realize that that's contrived and it's weird to say discover a new action in rock, paper, scissors. But the important detail here is there's some information lost. See, when we just look at these two value functions, we can see that they agree on the second best action of scissors. But all information about non-optimal actions is lost whenever we construct greedy policies. And this might be, this is clearly, there was some learning that happened here, and we'd like to be able to reuse and repurpose this learning. So if instead we take these two value functions and combine them, so in this case, you know, maybe we also use Q-mixing again, their second best actions, scissors, ends up with the highest value. This would give us an opponent policy that's playing this new action, scissors, and in this very constructed example, would result in discovering a new policy that played rock when we learned to beat scissors. This would make it so that the empirical game actually captures the full solution of the game a little bit faster. Now, again, this is a really constructed example to really just highlight that non-optimal action values are lost whenever you make a greedy policy. And this can be very useful information. So in essence, what we're doing here is we're transferring suboptimal action values, and we're using this to give rise to a unique greedy opponent policy. And we're going to then learn to play against that policy. We first evaluate mixed opponents on the running with scissors game. And when we plot the results in a similar way that we analyzed with mixed oracles, we notice something a bit troubling. Mixed opponents does not continue to converge, but instead spikes erratically. This is because mixed opponents is really an exploration-focused algorithm, because we're really just trying wildly new opponent policies and hoping that those are useful. And running with scissors is a very strategically simple game at its heart, and it doesn't seem to benefit from the added exploration. Instead, learning to exploit and play the game itself more effectively seems to be more essential. However, if we look at the harvest game, we can see on the right that mixed opponents finds a much stronger solution to PSRO and uses half the data to find that stronger solution, suggesting that this game requires much more exploration in order to really find the solution to the game. And really, the key takeaway from our work in mixed opponents is not we should definitely do mixed opponents. It's that we really need to think more about the exploration-exploitation trade-off as it pertains to discovering policies in multi-agent systems. In this case, specifically in ones where we're building up populations and doing game reasoning. So yeah, just to sort of recap a little bit, because I realized it was quite a lot. The key problem that we were looking at today is reducing the cost of game solving using what I refer to as strategic knowledge. These are predictions that depend on certain fixed opponent strategies. We saw two versions of this operationalized in the algorithms today. One being response knowledge, which is how to play against a fixed setting of players, and then opponent likelihood knowledge, which is how to use evidence to predict the specific co-players. In subsequent work, I've also looked at what I call world knowledge, which are predictions that are independent of the player strategies, and how this can be used and transfer in the same way to reduce the cost of PSRO. And in fact, what I show is that if you co-learn an empirical game alongside a world model, it allows you to use their mutual strengths to make each of them respectively better. And I'd be happy to talk more offline with anyone about that. So yeah, to summarize, today we saw three main different things. We first saw that Q-mixing allowed us to take pure strategy responses or policy responses and transfer them into distribution responses. And we saw that mixed oracles can use Q-mixing to transfer knowledge about past opponents to make game solving cheaper. And in mixed opponents, we saw that we can aggregate opponent policies into a single new policy and use this to do more effective exploration and game solving. And with that, I would be more than happy to take any questions. Sorry, I talked a little faster than I was hoping to.
All right, Gary, well, thank you for the great talk. This was very clear. But yeah, now we have a ton of time for questions, which is great. So if anybody wants to ask a question, raise your hand, and we'll, take this extra time to discuss.
Yeah, Manny.
Hi, can you hear me well? I had an issue with my internet.
Yeah, no worries.
Hi, no. So I was wondering while you were talking in this idea of unconditioned on the meta mix strategy, how does this method that you propose compares to other things that have been proposed, like neural population learning or simplex neural population learning, that sort of like do the same thing of conditioning the Q function against the meta mix strategy? Yeah.
Right. No, so that's a good question. So yeah, like I'm friends with a lot of people on that paper. So the first like very obvious academic thing to say as well, this paper was first. So they, but that aside, they really build off of this idea. I don't think directly. I don't think they really knew about this paper when they were coming up with it. So I think it's really an independent, similar discovery. So for those who don't know, Nupal, which was led, I think, by Daniel Hannes at a DeepMind. I might have the first, or Xiqi Liu. I don't remember who exactly was first on the paper. What it does is it learns one policy to be used through the whole process of game solving. The key thing that they have to do in order for that to be possible is they condition the policy on the distribution that the policy should be behaving or playing against. So sort of the policy has to be given as input the strategy. And that strategy changes over time. So if that doesn't make too much sense right away, at a higher level, what that means is the strategy size, so the number of policies that can be represented, is fixed and has to be predefined. So in the case of rock, paper, scissors, you could say, well, you know, there should be 3 policies. And so you know that you can sufficiently solve the game with only 3 policies. In general, you can't necessarily make that assumption. It's an extremely strong assumption that you know how many policies is sufficient to sort of represent the whole strategic landscape of a game. And that's sort of the big limiting assumption that they employ to get very effective transfer results. So they've got some really nice results because they only ever train one policy all at once. So that's quite nice. But the big downside is if you don't have enough domain expertise to pre-specify the amount of policies, the assumption's quite strong and can be quite limiting.
Well, yeah. So but don't you always have to make that assumption though? Like for instance, when you estimate the size of your population, like your StarCraft, then that's like a hyperparameter, right? Even in the case that you're specifying here, because I see that your key function is also conditional on this meta strategy, you also need to specify the size of your strategy space of your meta game. There's no way to escape that, right? Even if you're doing a population method, you have to define or like have like a finite size of your population as well.
Right. So I would push back a little bit on that. Remember, we're doing empirical game construction. So I don't think that the StarCraft people, for example, or like 888 policies, this is StarCraft, and then they ran it for 888. I think they stopped when they had the big demo, and like however many policies they made at that point, that was like their population. So similarly, all PSRO style algorithms generally do not require you to pre-specify the number of policies you build into the empirical game. A general limitation of PSRO is that actually you still have to do a game solving operation, and the complexity of game solving is quite high. So that actually limits how big empirical games ever get. So it's kind of surprising that there is an 888 by 888 empirical game. But to tie it back into what I see here in Q-mixing, we're not ever giving the network that is the Q function a strategy. So we're saying with these conditionals is that these Q values were trained in the setting where they were only trained to beat a certain opponent. And when I show the conditional of the strategy, what I'm saying is I'm trying to construct the Q values with respect to that distribution, not stuck as input that distribution. Does that make sense? But to shut down my own work, a limitation of it that directly hits to what you're saying at is the likelihood model. If you wanted to keep using likelihood models throughout game solving, you would need to recompute these, and you would probably need to, you either need to make an assumption about how you're going to recompute them that scales with a growing number of players, or you need to recompute it from scratch every time. In this case, we used heuristics that were effectively free. And I wouldn't worry too much about that because supervised learning is so much cheaper than reinforcement learning. So it's kind of like that's free in hindsight. So hopefully that gives you a more than complete picture than what you asked for. Yeah, Eugene?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for
Or
the great.
Daphne, sorry.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I had kind of an open question. So you mentioned that we should pay more attention to the exploration exploitation balance, or I don't remember how exactly you phrased it. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Right. So as an example, if we go all the way back to is it this one? Where did I have it? This guy. So exploration exploitation, obviously in reinforcement learning, for those who are familiar, very fundamental question. Really what I was saying when I mentioned that in this context is we need to think about it in the terms of understanding the strategic landscape of the game, because we don't have the same fixed problem as we do when there's only one player. And we see this very directly in the AlphaStar work. They have different exploration methods, and these are all heuristics. So they have handcrafted certain ways of determining how certain players should be played and how they should be beaten. So we can see here that like they needed to like hand bake in many different ways to do exploration in order to get their results in StarCraft. So it would be nice if we had more automatic ways of doing that, or maybe more principled ways. Because if I recall correctly, there wasn't theoretical grounding as to why maybe these particular ones made sense. In the context of my work, I showed that I looked at versions of PSRO where I just completely swap out how you do strategy exploration. You could imagine alternating strategy exploration and exploitation as opposed to just doing one or the other. And you know, this AlphaStar work is doing things in parallel, so clearly that seems to work quite nicely. And we've got very limited work on that, and that's probably because it's crazy expensive to do. Does that answer your question, or
yeah,
any more specific? Cool. We have a few more minutes if anyone else has any other questions about anything. If not, feel free to get in contact with on Slack or afterwards. Yeah, Eugene?
You're not getting away so easily.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question. So I'm a bit puzzled about this question I asked earlier, which is about mixing within episodes. Like how does this, you're playing against opponents that don't mix within episodes and don't like try to do any like, they don't, do the agents you play against explicitly try to kind of cause uncertainty over which type of policy they are?
No, so there's no sort of meta reasoning, or if you want, or hierarchical reasoning that any of the policies are playing. You are right to be sort of slightly confused or troubled by that. So to help unpack the question for those who are following along, I think Eugene's question is, hey, when you're doing Q mixing and you weight all of the opponents by the distribution of each of the opponents, you're mixing them at every single time step, but they're not being sampled at every time step. They're being sampled at every game. So that's kind of awkward. Really, that version of Q mixing was a baseline. It is a baseline of like, what if we just do like the simplest thing and just use prior information about the opponent that we could know before we played the game at all. So this worked better than we thought it would. And it's not principled as to why it worked well. and in general, maybe doesn't. So that's fine. The extension of it, which is getting closer and closer to this exact computation, is when we did the learned likelihood, which is not mixing based off of that distribution, but instead looking both at the initial opponent distribution and all evidence that we've got about the current opponent policy up till now, up till the current time step in this one episode, computing the likelihood that we think we're playing against that policy. And then using this new informed belief of the opponent to do this weighting. So that's much more principled and makes way more sense. And as I sort of alluded to, you can do this exact computation, but the assumptions are ridiculous, frankly. Hopefully that answers everything.
Yeah, that clears things up. Thank you.
Yeah. Manny?
Hey, so in general, this is like a question that I have from this line of work. Sorry, and it is like when you talk about like in terms of like transfer and possibly generalization, this is something that we are used to seeing in RL or like in supervised learning. But here, it takes like I cannot like marry this idea that is nothing other than trying to reach the Nash. Because if you have the idea of like maximizing expected return, basically what you have is like just reach the Nash and you're done. So that's sort of like my question is, what is the aim in the end on this like transferring? Is like reaching the Nash faster, or yeah, it's like a very general question. So
Right. So yeah, in this case, I did mention Nash. I do need to throw in the caveat that you know, all of these algorithms can be applied to any solution concept. We only evaluated Nash here today. It's the most common one, etc. But the real key of what my line of work is you could summarize it crudely as we'd like to find Nash and we want to do it cheaper, a lot cheaper. And the way we're measuring cost is with data used to train policies. So this is, I would say, analogous again to efficient RL, like the 100K Atari versus the 20 million. Like we can't afford to run all these GPUs and drown all the polar bears. We gotta really ship-shape this stuff up. Does that answer your question? Cool. And that's the end of the time, and I think we have a hard cutoff. Oh,
but thank you so much for the talk. This was a great talk.
Great, thank you, Eugene. I can stay back a little bit more to answer Seth's question, but if anyone has to go, feel free to bow out, and feel free to end the recording anytime.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording now.
Cool, thank you.